newcomer. We got even less certain about newcomer. He's in China at the moment, and he may have connectivity issues. So, may I suggest that we start? And I just want to say that we have a distinguished panel. At least we have 3/4 of it with us. We have Valerie Picard, who is the head of trade from the International Chamber of Commerce. We have Hamid Mamdouh, who he's now senior counselor at King and Spalding, I think, making the money that he thought wasn't enough in the WTO. And then we have Matthew Wilson, who is probably known to many of you. He was in the ITC for quite a while, and now he's the ambassador of Barbados. Okay. So I think we'll go in the order that you're on the program. I'm not going to have to introduce any of you really, because not only am I sure that you're already well known, but because your CVs are attached to the invitation. Okay, so also I should mention this document which was attached to the invitation, which is the responsibility of the International Chamber of Commerce. The ICC prepared this document with a little help from their friends. And I think, part of the idea is not to restrict ourselves only to this document, but certainly this is a good guidance for the issues that are there and what the business community think about them. So with that, Valerie, can I ask you to speak? And can I also ask the panelists to try to stick to 10 minutes so that we do have a chance for discussion afterwards? Valerie.
Great, thanks, thank you, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again and talking about this subject. And I do realize that I want to say at the outset, some of you we actually spoke to about this paper even before it came out. We've also had a discussion on it. So apologies in advance for those of you who are already quite familiar with it, but. If you'll allow me, I'll go into a little bit the history and why we've done it, and give a brief overview. And absolutely promising to stick to time. And also very much, I do like what you said, Patrick, that it's a framework. So all of the answers are not in this document. So very much it's supposed to be a basis for discussion. So just to take a step back on why we did this at the International Chamber of Commerce and why we put this out is we felt that WTO reform and WTO itself is very, very important to the private sector. The private sector needs and wants a fully functioning WTO. And so we had in the past made recommendations, and it was always in our global business priorities at the prior ministerial saying, we need WTO reform. And so we thought at this point, and as we were looking at what we could do to be helpful in the discussion, that we would put forward our own framework and putting out what we're seeing from our perspective, from the business perspective, starting out also from the fact that from a private sector perspective, there's no CEO that would reform an organization without having a plan in place for the reform of the organization. So we started from that place. And if you look at the paper, the first thing we did a diagnostic of the challenges, and I won't go into all of them. They're there, and I'm sure Hamid will want to touch on a few of them. But I think it's also really important to know that the process of how we came to this paper, we developed a concept note. We consulted broadly with the ICC network, which goes across the globe. So multi-levels of development, different sectors, to get their feedback into this. And we also spoke with over 20 missions and ambassadors in Geneva, and including Ambassador Wilson, Ambassador Machado, and others on this call. And I want to thank you again for the inputs into the paper. And really, if there's one thing that we really want to get across from a private sector perspective, is that all three functions matter to the private sector. That's the first thing. So we really considered that the reform has to be holistic, also because of the way that the WTO is designed. So all three functions have to work together. So you can't just fix a part of it. It's not going to actually fix the problem. But then when we go into the different implications and different areas of where we're looking for reform, of course, number one, the negotiating function. So at the moment, the private, there aren't new, or we can say perhaps more aptly, updated rules that have been coming out of the WTO. The private sector is anxious for these rules. They want these rules. These updated rules to be able to trade with certainty and predictability in today's environment. We often hear the future of trade is digital. I sort of say, no, trade is digital. It's the future is now. So we need to catch up. And so to update the rule book to what the real world realities are today. And one thing I will say, of course, is we do recognize the complexity. And I think this is important to say is we don't expect everything to happen overnight. That's not what we're suggesting. We know it's not, it hasn't happened yet, but we want to see, and I come back to this, is a mapping, an agreement, a work plan. This is what we plan to do, and some sort of progress towards these goals. And so I've mentioned the negotiating function in terms of, and we put in the paper a list of areas. We didn't put them with any order of priority because we probably would still not have the paper out if I was trying to get an order of priority among our members in terms of, but really just to give an idea. But the list is pretty long, and it shows, that really there's a lot of work to be done. And the other thing is, and I think this comes to a point that's later on in the paper, but that's really also very, very important for the private sector, is this notion of the engagement of the private sector at the WTO. We hear about it, we know, and particularly, and this is where we're focused on, is the need to have structured engagement for at the WTO. And this is not to come in to lobby, it's to support the rulemaking process. That business can come in and provide its expertise, its insights, its data. I mean, this is what we do, for example, and I've talked about this before, you've heard me talk about what we do at the World Customs Organization. There's a structured process for how we're able to feed into the process. The questions that were asked, the delegations will ask very specific questions. We have a great, we're in discussions with them about expanding even how we're working with them, because they're really, really pleased with the way that the support is going. But all of this is intended to be supportive and to work with the WTO and the negotiation member states towards the shared objective of delivering the goals. So I know sometimes it can be seen as adversarial, sort of thing, and that's not at all the intent, because it would be not very useful, for one thing. And so we really, and this is, I hear it time and again, is how can we have more private sector engagement? So, and I think that's good news. There's still the appetite there from the private sector, which, shouldn't be taken for granted. So there's still very much a desire to be providing feedback and inputs, but there has to be something to feed into. And so that goes back to starting to work on the negotiating function. I don't want to, there's of course also dispute settlement, equally important to the private sector. Everyone is more than aware of the dysfunction at the moment, and wants a resolution. How it gets resolved, private sectors doesn't, at the end of the day, and that's what we say in the paper, I'll say it a little bit more coarsely, we don't necessarily care how you get there. We just want to know that the decisions are final and binding, and so that we can rely on them to plan and invest and trade. So there's a lot of very technical discussions. That's not necessarily where the private sector can be helpful in terms of how those very technical issues are resolved, but very, very keen. And I think you're hearing around MC13, those people are starting to see a lot of statements to that effect of please, please, please fix this. We need this to get fixed. So very much still. And then of course, there's also the monitoring and deliberative function, and equally important. We rely on those rules of transparency. Business needs those. It's oftentimes the WTO is the only place where that information is available. So again, we want to see and make sure that it is transparent, that that monitoring and transparency function is working. So, the message we have is pretty simple in a sense, coming out of this reform paper. It's, one, WTO matters to business very much. There is no substitute for it. Two, we would like to see it do more. We're not taking for granted already what it's doing. I think sometimes it's something we hear often, like, you often, when you're focusing on fixing something, you also forget what's working well. And there are things inside that are also very much working well and are good examples. But we really, and I can only emphasize again how we want to see on reform, and I think looking ahead to MC13, and I'll start to, is that we're realistic in terms of where the discussions, but we really would like to see reaffirmation of the principles recall the common purpose of the system, reaffirm the foundational purpose, the foundational principles. A strong political statement would be a really good start. And then work on a work program, to develop this holistic approach to WTO reform, so that it can be delivered over the next however long. So that's a bit where we're coming from and where we're going. I'll let you read the paper, and Hamid will no doubt add all the color and everything that I've absolutely forgotten to say. But again, just want to emphasize how important this is from a private sector perspective. The WTO is still relevant, and we need to preserve that relevancy. So I'll stop there and hand it back so that I'm at time, Patrick, and then look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Valerie. I have to say, I thought the paper was pretty complete in terms of as a wish list. How much of this is going to get done, of course, is another question. Now, maybe Hamid would have some ideas on that score as well. Hamid.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Valerie. You've done a great job covering the entire terrain. I think I would have very little to add. The only points I would emphasize in what you said basically is this is about mapping out an agenda. This is about having a plan, and it is important that we tried, even throughout the process that led to this paper, to have a discussion about the diagnostic aspect of it. I mean, why the WTO is where it is today. It's not because history is interesting, but also because a good diagnostic would inform best the solutions that may be proposed in the future through the discussions of reform. Now, we looked at it in a sort of a holistic way. The point I would add here about the three functions is that there is a great deal of interconnectedness between the three. In other words, it is quite difficult to see that one function can be fixed and work properly without the other two functions taking shape as well. And here there have been concerns about laying a lot of emphasis on dispute settlement alone, while not laying enough emphasis on the negotiating function, for example. Now, I'm sure these things will sort of balance themselves out throughout the discussions, but the negotiating function is something that is quite perhaps interesting to look at in this paper, because this is where the paper tries to make a distinction between the institutional challenges that are cross-cutting throughout any kind of negotiating item on the agenda now, as opposed to the negotiating items themselves, agriculture, fisheries subsidies, and the list goes on, as you will see in the paper. But the institutional challenges are very important to sort out as well, like how do you apply special and differential treatment, the need to clarify the rules on plurilateral negotiations and plurilateral outcomes, capacity building for developing countries and LDCs, which I think is terribly important systemically, because I'm sure you would notice that all the resources, almost all the resources devoted to capacity building so far have been devoted to implementation of negotiated outcomes. But there's very little actually devoted to the negotiations themselves. Building capacity to negotiate among developing countries and LDCs is terribly important, because what you get in the absence of that really is blockages, because the information gap is quite substantial, that it inhibits the negotiating function itself. Now, these are the sort of insights that are hoped to assist or contribute to the discussions on WTO reform going forward. Now, of course, you will see at the end of the paper that the aspiration here was that some kind of a work program on WTO reform would come out of MC13. We're not sure that this would be feasible, but then I think it is hoped also that this paper would continue to be a contribution that can inform discussions going beyond MC13 into the deep work of WTO reform as we go forward beyond the ministerial. And with that, I'm sure that we will hear also more interesting things from both João and Matthew, and I look forward to the discussion that this group would bring along as well. So thanks, and back to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Hamid, for that. Good. Joe, I'm sorry I didn't introduce you properly, the ambassador for the EU. You are very welcome, and please go ahead and try and stick to 10 minutes if you can. And you don't have to restrict yourself to what's in this paper, but you know the paper is a pretty useful guide of some of the issues that are out there, and a particularly useful guide of what the aspirations and priorities of the business sector.
Thank you, Patrick. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this very interesting and important discussion on WTO reform. And I would start by saying I like very much the paper, very well done, very solid paper. And I think the diagnostic that is there can largely be shared, I would say, by the vast majority of WTO members. So it's a very good contribution, a very, very good paper. What I would focus is on other things, not to go over always through the same issues that we tend to focus. Of course, ideally, WTO reform, and as the paper argues, should be a plan with a structure and a coherent view for the organization. Where do we want to go collectively with WTO? Unfortunately, I'm afraid we are not there. Everyone speaks about WTO reform, but everyone has different ideas about what reform means, and everyone has different interests of what parts of the reform they want to push. And the result of this situation is that for the moment, WTO reform is a collection of different issues, not very well articulated. That's good, at least, that we are starting, but is not something with a plan, in the sense of what do we want, where do we want the organization to be. So it's a collection. I mean, I think on dispute settlement, everyone, except probably one member, important, does not share the same view about the role of dispute settlement, and particularly the issue of appeals. But the work is being done, and there has been quite a lot of engagement and constructive engagement. On negotiations, and I agree, that the question that we have to deal, it should be dealt in a more systemic way. But given the current geopolitical situation, I don't think that the membership is ready to engage in a discussion how to integrate theoretically plurilateral approaches into the WTO. Ideally, that should be the way. But what is happening is that this is happening in a piecemeal way, one by one, depending on the characteristics of each of the plurilaterals. We have had the experience of domestic regulation in services. We are having the experience on investment facilitation right now, and we will have on e-commerce. So it's not part of the same set of principles that could be applicable. We are doing as each case arises. Maybe, and certainly is the best way to do it right now. And maybe after a while, we will distill the principles that need to be encapsulated in a more principled approach. But this is happening as they come, as the negotiations are concluded. On deliberations, and you know that European Union is very keen to start a discussion on industrial policies and state intervention, but there is a lot of resistance even to discuss issues. The membership is not yet ready. I think in the end, we will have to discuss that because otherwise the organization becomes irrelevant. But even to start a deliberation in a non-prejudicial manner, which I think should be the way, you have a lot of resistance. A lot of resistance because people are suspicious. What will happen if I, even to, for example, speak about climate? There is always hanging the suspicion that this will be a way to legitimize measures that governments are taking. But we need to enter in these discussions in a non-prejudicial basis. So, in a nutshell, this reform is happening. In a way, is happening by doing on a daily basis, is not part of a coherent strategy of the membership. Maybe we come to a coherent strategy later on. I just hope that we don't need to touch the bottom to realize and wake up and come with a strategy, as it has happened in the past. But it is happening. It will be bumpy. But I think we will be advancing. Of course, if you look from a business perspective, they will say, what are these guys doing? There is no clear orientation where we are heading. But I think in the current environment is the maximum that we can do, and we should capitalize on it and try to advance to improve the three functions of the organization. There is, I have to say, many people that want, and we are calling it here in Geneva, reform by doing, but there are a lot of attempts as well to do what I call personally reform by undoing, which is go back to the Uruguay round and reopen the old box. Because the agreement put constraints, the agreement put that, or there is not even a consensus that trade can be a vehicle to development. Of course, it's not a solution. Needs to be accompanied by many other policies. But there is a risk of reform by undoing. And I think we need to preserve what we have. I'm not saying that the rules negotiated 30 years ago are still valid, but you should not destroy everything. Let's try to build on to make them more relevant, but not by undoing the great work that was done in the past. I will stop here for the moment. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, João. Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. And great publication, Valerie and Hamid. Easy to read, very clear in what you're trying to achieve. So thank you for that. And Ambassador, you say reform by undoing. I say reform by redoing. So I think we have some different perspectives on that idea of relooking at some of the old rules that simply don't work for developing countries nowadays. But listen, MC13 is supposed to be this reform ministerial, and my apologies to all the vegans on the call, but for me, that's the equivalent of having hosting a vegan conference at a barbecue restaurant. There's just an inherent tension to discuss WTO and reform. Because us in the trade world, we get very nervous about that term reform because those who benefit from the status quo get nervous that their status quo is going to be disrupted. And those without agency, many small developing countries, we worry that what little influence we have is going to be further eroded. And the trade world, we like to move very discreetly and at our own pace and without too much fanfare. And there's a very old school positioning that often sees WTO only through the lens of strict rulemaking, which sometimes means that WTO is seen just as a legal rulemaking body where every action has to have the end game of making new rules. And I don't think that that is what a WTO for the 21st century should only be about. But the reality, I think, is pushing the WTO to have this conversation. I mean, let's face it, IOs are in trouble, multilateralism is in trouble, and depending on how some key elections go this year, the WTO may be in even more trouble. But that said, as the ambassador from the EU said, reform is happening, what I call reform with a small r. The changes happening in the committees to make the work more efficient, digitalizing methods and documentation, having minutes done quicker. I mean, it's all very commendable and the package is good. And then, of course, you had the retreat that was called by the chair of the General Council to look at these proposals on development and on trade and development and industrial policy and on policy space. And I think that's all really important. But I have to say that some of what people are really trying to highlight as major reforms for many of us is what any organization should be doing anyway, which is making its processes easier and more accessible. So I think we have to be careful how much fanfare we want to give what should be the day-to-day business of an efficient organization. And then if you look at the modalities for MC13, you see that there are two substantive deliberative sessions on trade and sustainable development, including trade and industrial policy and policy space for industrial development, and then another one on trade and inclusion. So this is another part of massaging the reform agenda, just having discussions on things which many of us feel the WTO should at least begin to pay some attention to. But I don't think that there's any, and I go back to the ICC paper on what you call a common purpose and vision to develop a comprehensive work program on WTO reform. I don't think that exists. The ambassador intimated that, but I think that that needs to happen in the future. And like Patrick and Hamid, as a former WTO Secretariat employee, I also believe an important part of the reform is better empowering the WTO Secretariat to give them more opportunity to support developing countries and LDCs in terms of research and knowledge projects and bridging the gap in negotiations in a way what Hamid said as well, helping them to build the capacity to negotiate, not just to implement. And I'm sure that that is going to be maybe an important part of what the WTO DG is doing in terms of her Secretariat transformation project. Then there's reform with the big R, which is around the dispute settlement process. I'm not going to go into that because we all know the current state of play, and frankly, there's nothing I could say here today that is going to move the process along. We know that it's a ticking clock. Can I ask Baptiste to turn off his mic, please? We know it's a bit of a ticking clock, but we need to have a solution that works for all of us, but importantly works for the system. Well, I'm not going to go further into the dispute settlement issues. Now, what are some of the other possible reforms? What I call the corridor whisper reforms, the things that we all talk about in the corridors, but not out in public where it can be recorded. The first one is how to address these new issues, the GSIs and the plurilaterals. And this has both systemic and practical implications. Because right now we're grappling with how how to treat an investment facilitation for development agreement that has the support of over 100 members. How does one address this? How does one multilateralize this? And then we have issues like women in trade and MSMEs, issues that all of us say are very important to all of us, and many of us are formally engaged. And then there are new issues on the horizon. I mean, how does the WTO deal with climate, with carbon border adjustment measures? How do they deal with inclusion? How does it deal with artificial intelligence? These are all contemporary matters that the WTO, if it's supposed to be relevant, especially to the business community, has to find ways to incorporate into their architecture. But what's really interesting about this is that there's no clean and clear developing divide here on these issues, because a majority of developing countries are also involved in one or more of these so-called GSIs. So the question is, will time take care of this and naturally bring them into the WTO system, or are we going to have very clear decisions made to make that happen? And then second, the role of the private sector, as we've discussed today. That is a huge potential reform, how to fully bring the private sector's views on board in the negotiations. And I have to be honest, I don't have any faith that there's any real appetite for this in the core work of the WTO. We can bring the private sector in the WTO Public Forum, the Aid for Trade Global Review, in workshops, in open days. The MSME working group receives input from the private sector, but I'm not sensing, if I'm honest, that the reform, even immediate future reforms that the majority of members want, include a deeper role for the private sector. That said, I think, if you look at certain initiatives like the DG's recent creation of the Advisory Business Council is a step in the right direction, especially because it includes MSMEs and larger businesses, and it includes entities from both small and larger WTO members. And then third, the real elephant in the room, the real reform that some developed countries in particular really want, the emergence of this kind of select few developing countries as major trading nations is really shifted the power dynamic within the WTO, and has also meant that the issue of differentiation amongst developing countries has become a real significant factor in the organization's inability to reach consensus on the negotiating functions. We know that some developed countries are very reluctant to give blanket S&D to developing countries. And on the other hand, some of these countries have refrained from voluntarily indicating that they would not avail of special and differential treatment provisions, which they're well within their rights to do. So we have this tension between the rights and responsibilities to provide S&DT to all developing countries, but also the reality is that all developing countries are simply not equal in their ability to influence world trade. And then unfortunately, the WTO negotiating function is being, what some will say is being infested, what others will say is being infused with larger geopolitical issues. And this is currently a factor that we're seeing in the fishery subsidies negotiations. But we have to look at some innovative mechanisms that the WTO and members have been able to come up with in the last couple of years. Small players de minimis in the fishery subsidies negotiation, S&DT based on self-designated categories, and then, of course, what was achieved in the trade facilitation agreement, which is when capacity is achieved. So I think these small but important reforms in negotiating practices and outcomes could give us some idea of how we can maybe move the negotiating function forward in the future without, I think, disrupting what would be very difficult to disrupt, which is this whole idea of who is deserving under the laws and rules and regulations of special and differential treatment. So I'll stop there, Patrick, and I'll look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Many thanks, Matthew. Well, there's areas of some agreement and quite a few areas of disagreement, as far as I can tell, which is not very surprising. But it does raise the question of what the expectations are for MC13, which I noticed that in the blurb that came with the invitation, somebody wrote, And the upcoming WTO Ministerial Conference, MC13, will be an opportunity to see how the organization can make the expected progress to face up to the current challenges facing the organization, and to ensure that a thriving and fit-for-purpose WTO, which can provide needed certainty and predictability to traders across the world. So it's the expected bit that surprised me a little bit. From what I'm hearing, it's going to be a rather meager harvest from MC13. And this, I mean, I would love, before we go to questions, can I just quickly ask the panelists to say a few words on whether I'm being unduly unhelpful by saying it's going to be meager at best, or whether you feel that there's something that could be done, that can be done in the few weeks that are left, very few weeks that are left, that could give some momentum to results. Now, the results from MC12, I think they were slightly overhyped as unprecedented, victorious, unprecedented results, but there were some results. So can I just put that question, going in the same sequence, to the panelists before we go to questions, because we've got quite a lot of time. Valerie.
Thanks. So from a private sector perspective on MC13, I think the private sector is quite realistic about what the outcomes will be. I think there's a couple of issues though. One is the moratorium. I mean, that is the number one thing across the world, and every single company absolutely needs to be renewed. It would send such a terrible signal if it were not to be renewed. So at least securing that from the private sector perspective is the number one priority. And then I think beyond that, I think what would be, and I guess because the question you're sort of asking is what does success look like at an MC13, and to use that phrase. But I think the other thing is realistic in terms of what will actually come out. So I think is looking more towards, can there be some strong political statements on key issues? Can there be commitments to work on things? You know, that already would be very, very good. And, you know, and then we can work towards things. So I think that's what from our perspective, the expectations are. We'd obviously welcome more, but just being realistic.
Okay, thanks, Valerie. Hamid.
I think it's quite challenging looking at MC13 and how it's shaping up, although, you know, in previous ministerials, we've seen situations get worse before they get better. So I wouldn't completely lose hope that we might get some kind of a positive outcome. Now, when I say positive outcome here, the expectation that MC13 would produce a work program for WTO reform, I think is non-existent now. And João and Matthew basically pointed in that direction very clearly.
I agree on that.
But what I hope for, at least, that MC13 will produce some language which would call upon the General Council and the members to put together some kind of a plan for WTO reform. Because if we don't even have that kind of message coming out of MC13, we run the risk of reaching MC14 with more or less where we are today. The progress that happened since MC12, I think there's a reform by doing, but as Matthew said, the reform by doing agenda actually are the kind of things that councils and committees would do in their day-to-day housekeeping work within their rules of procedure. You don't need a reform agenda for that. So that would be my aspiration, to send out a signal that there has to be a plan for reform. Back to you.
That's, yeah, okay. João.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's we don't know yet where we will be, but assuming that if we can get phase 2 of fisheries, if we can launch a process on agriculture negotiations that last time was silent and non-existent, if you can renew the moratorium, if we can advance the integration of IFD, We have now the massive regulation in services that as a way forward. If we agree on 2-3 topics for deliberation, I think that's quite presentable in the current environment. We are not living in a period where we are expecting big bangs. This is simply not feasible right now. So if we can deliver on around this sort of issues, I think that will be very good. And put the organization, of course, it's not addressing yet the key issues that of trade and economic relations of today. There are still many shortcomings, but it shows that we are progressing at the pace that is the pace that the geopolitical situation allows, in the sense that there is no consensus anymore on the purpose and the objectives for the organization right now. So I don't lose hope. If we can deliver something around these elements, I think would be good progress.
Right. Thanks. Matthew.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Joel. I mean, look, right now, I think about 45% chance of us delivering on fisheries 2. Now, that 45 can go up to 75 within 2 days, huh? So you just never know. A lot will depend on what happens in the next week and a half. On agriculture, I think we pretty much know what's going to happen. It's just going to be a roadmap to continue to do work. But I have to tell you, the expectation for there to at least be a little bit more on something as fundamental as food security is strong. There must be something on development. And I'm so disappointed, I have to be honest with you, so disappointed when I sit in the CTD special session and I see developing countries and these agreement-specific proposals, which have been there for many, many, many years, Patrick and Hamid, you know these. They've been whittled down to 10, and now there are essentially 2 on the table for decision. And we still cannot achieve decisions on something which I think is so incredibly simple, and where developing countries are continuing to put forward why these are important to them. So there has to be something on development, including for LDCs. And then, of course, we have the two accessions, as you know. Services, I will say that services is the issue that has just dropped off the agenda, aside from the kind of domestic regulation. But CARICOM actually has been the one in the discussions on the outcome document that has introduced a paragraph on services. So we hope that there'll at least be some kind of roadmap to have a discussion on services moving forward. I agree, we need to find a way to incorporate investment facilitation for development in some way. And then if we have a roadmap, some pathways to discussing some of these contemporary issues, and here there has to be a balance. We cannot discuss industrial policy for development without recognizing that developing countries want to discuss this notion of policy space and whatever that is configured to be. So there has to also be a balance in what we put forward for future discussions in the WTO. And then finally, the next ministerial should be a development ministerial. People wanted this one to be a reform ministerial. Let the next ministerial, MC14, be a development ministerial. I have people focus on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have 45 minutes if we want. I think it would be good now to turn this over to the floor and get some questions for the panelists. You can ask specific panelists if you like, or we just let the panelists decide for themselves what they have to say about the different things. Let's take 2 or 3 questions at a time and see how we go from there. So, anyone like to start the ball rolling? No. Oh, well. Silence. Sherry, are you going to break the ice? I saw you switch your camera on.
Yes, I'm happy to break the ice, Patrick.
Go on then.
All right, thank you. I've listened to all of the discussion with great interest and a little bit of dismay and a little bit of hope, alternating from time to time. Since my great area of passion is services, and since services are so vital to the world economy and to the development of every single WTO member and to the future of the organization, I would just like to pose a bit of thought-provoking questions about services. Why is the organization ignoring them? Why are they not more present in the general discussions on the future of the WTO? Why is the services agenda laying dormant for such a long time? And what is being thought about in terms of this ministerial conference in order to change that for the future, if we could?
Any other questions?
Yeah.
We're getting on with, or shall we start with that one? Is that Willie Alfaro? It is. Willie, show your face. Okay.
Yes, I
Shoot.
am. I'm here. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for the presentation. I was very interested by some of the remarks regarding the role of the Secretariat and how the Secretariat could help developing countries, even in the area of negotiations. And if I'm not mistaken, Matthew referred to the contribution that the Secretariat can make in terms of increasing knowledge and research. Now, how would that work? What would be the steps required to become a more proactive secretariat? And I'm saying that because maybe not all members would like us to go this additional step. But I would like to hear the remarks of what would be required to move into that role. Thanks.
Okay, let's go back to the panelists. The first question is on services. Why is services lagging behind? Is it because the agreement is badly designed? Is it because people don't think that there's any reason to worry about services? They're liberal enough as it is. Look, you see Hamid smile. He really wants to talk. I think it was my first remark that provoked him.
Well, I would expect nothing less than provocation from you, Patrick. No, I think it's a very, very well-placed question, Sherry. The question is, why do we have an agreement which calls upon members to engage in successive rounds of negotiations? The first starting in 2000 and then periodically thereafter, and yet we're 2024 and we have not concluded one single round of negotiations. Now, the history of this actually is that we started the negotiations in 2000 and then got folded into the Doha round, and the rest of it is history. Now, the reality is, I think the politics made the Doha round predominantly about agriculture negotiations and NAMA. And you would recall that in July 2008, when we were close to reaching agreement on modalities on agriculture and NAMA, the EU and other proponents of the services negotiations said, well, we're not ready to agree until we have the market access triangle. And that's why we had a signaling conference. Once you add the signaling conference, the picture of what is on offer on the services negotiating table completely changed. Now, after that, everything went dormant, not just services. Now, the reason why, which is Sherry's question, is the negotiating function itself of the WTO has actually been weakened, except for very, very few exceptions. And the second is, there is little attention that is being given in capitals to services policies and services trade. If you notice the political narratives in capitals now when it comes to trade policy, it's basically about merchandise trade, products crossing borders. That sort of bias in perception, I think, needs to be corrected somehow. How do you correct that? That's another conversation. But all the conversations about trade policy in Washington and to a large extent in Brussels, and João might correct me on this as well as in developing countries, it's all about merchandise trade. Now that perception needs to be corrected. The services negotiations actually, in my view, is a very, very clear must. Not only that, but lots of low-hanging fruits there, because the process of liberalization has advanced way beyond the schedules that we have now. So you can actually have a success that is not that difficult to achieve, but the implications of which I think would be great. Now, one last comment about the question that Willie raised regarding the role of the Secretariat. I think old people like you, Patrick, and myself would recall that the Secretariat used to play a much more active role in informing delegations on negotiating issues. We've seen that since the establishment of the WTO and even during the old days of the GATT. Now that needs to be done in a way, of course, and it used to be done in a way where the Secretariat plays a very impartial and neutral role that is strictly and professionally substantive, not telling developing countries what's good for them, but basically informing them of the substantive details of the issues so that they would be informed when they come to make their negotiating choices. There is a way of doing it. It's been done in the past. It used to be a regular function of the Secretariat. It's just that the political environment actually gradually eroded that role. In a way similar actually to how it eroded the interaction with the private sector. I would recall, so would you, that during the Uruguay round, we were on daily contact with the private sector because they were our reality check when we were developing new rules on services and on other things. Now, all that has subsided also because of political reasons. So I think the diagnostic is there. The question is, what do we do about it? And maybe João and Matthew might have something to say about what do we do now. So back to you.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists like to come in on
yeah, Patrick, I'd like to respond to Willie. I think one of the first things is what is the terms of reference of the Secretariat? And that I don't know. Is there terms of reference for Secretariat interaction with member states that already allows this to be done? Because if there is, then as Hamid said, I mean, it's just politics kind of infusing and infecting what the WTO Secretariat should be doing. So that for me would be my starting point. Then the second thing is build the confidence of the Secretariat. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, a couple of years ago, I think you saw a WTO Secretariat that felt nervous about doing anything that was out of the ordinary. They just didn't have the confidence to be able to do anything beyond present facts. So I think we also need to look at rebuilding the confidence of the Secretariat. The third thing is I find it very difficult that small vulnerable economies and LDCs who have such a lack of capacity, such an absolute shocking lack of capacity and feet on the ground, could not go to the WTO Secretariat and ask them to do some analysis for them. I mean, we pay WTO dues as much as anyone else does. It may not be as much as Canada does or Chile or India, but we pay. So how on earth can we not be able to get what we need from a Secretariat that we pay for? Then the fourth thing is relooking at the technical assistance that the WTO delivers is not good enough anymore to just go and teach people what is in an agreement and to share facts. We expect more than that. We expect more value added from a Secretariat, not just showing us what is in an agreement. And then the fifth, excuse me, I think you've seen the Secretariat already begin to do that by the incredible partnership ecosystem that they've started to build with other organizations and with other agencies. So a lot of this joint work that they do is actually de facto incredibly useful analysis for all members. And I think that continuing to expand on that and maybe be even a little bit more radical in the kind of projects and analysis that you take on, I think would also, help to make people feel a little bit more comfortable with the Secretariat having a greater, more value added role, Billy. Thanks.
Thanks. Does João or Valerie wish to add anything on these 2 points?
Yes, Patrick. Starting with the last point on, I agree much with Matthew on what happens to the Secretariat. I would say on one side, it has been undercut from within by the leadership in the past, not to be active unless members agree. So there has been no stimulus on one side for the Secretariat to continue to play the role it used to play from within. Secondly, from outside, the members don't have any more the reflex to ask things to the Secretariat to do, and that's a pity. Take the example, the only multilateral negotiation that is going on right now and in the past years has been fisheries. Well, I've never seen anyone ask the Secretariat do a paper, factual one, analysis on that and that and that and that, which happened in the past. The only thing you have is submissions by members. There is no request from the members to the Secretariat to produce background notes. So I think to start, it should come from members already to ask the Secretariat to come forward and put papers, of course, never negotiating policy or papers, but background useful information. That in the past used to feed a lot the discussions in the different rooms. Now on services, it's a puzzle for me, because when we speak about WTO reform, we speak about we need to have more flexible negotiating approaches, how to integrate plurilaterals if you cannot reach multilateral agreement. Well, the GATS allows for all of that. The GATS agreement already allows for all of that. The simple thing is that members are not using. I don't think, I mean, it's because the negotiating function has been weakened. The political will has been weakened. And I think you are right that many people in capital, many governments still see trade through manufacturing, through goods, and they don't see. I think services has a huge potential because it's flexible. You can modulate the SDT inside and go away from these it's right that we have to have and have the problems that all developing countries are taken as an entity, which creates difficulties in the case of some advanced developing countries. Services we can modulate, you can do all that already. I think this GATS already is WTO reformed. If we could do that for the other areas, that would be great. But it's a puzzle, and I saw that recently the World Bank produced another report on the importance of services, and no one picks. It's not being picked. It's a puzzle. I don't have the right reply, frankly. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on this particular issue, I mean, it's services is considerably more than half of all global GDP and of international trade, if you measure it properly. And so it is quite extraordinary. And that's either the agreement is absolutely fine, which I don't think anyone would seriously argue that you know, having these way below binding commitments and various other things, that it is. So yeah. I mean, I think there's a good lot to be done, but we never really hear what it is that people object to, why they don't do it. I mean, if they just look at how dependent they are on services, you'd think that they'd want to try and get as much as they could by way of guarantees and certainty in relation to the trade aspect. But anyhow, Valerie, do you just like to say anything about any of this?
Yeah, no, thanks. I was going to jump into the discussion of the role of the Secretariat. So obviously, I think, you know, from our perspective, there's an important role to be played in terms of by strengthening the Secretariat and making it a point of reference. You know, it should be the place that businesses all look to for information on trade. Is it today? I don't know. How many go to, you know, to the WTO website for information? I would posit not very many. And so that would raise the visibility and the strength of the organization. That's one thing. And then two is also what Hamid alluded to earlier, was engagement with the private sector. And I think that's a really, really important point as well, because that the Secretariat has a really important role to play in being that conduit between the private sector and the members. I mean, that's how we work at the WCO. I'm sorry to keep bringing that up, but that's our experience. I know it's very different, you know, in terms of the two organizations, and it's not a perfect parallel. So, you know, but in terms of, you know, they formulate the request, the members come, it's all very organized. And it's their responsibility then to ensure that we're, you know, that the views are representative and varied and so forth. So, you know, strengthening that would, of course, help us. And, you know, so also so that private sector sort of not just getting in wherever they can, you know, in a sort of, I don't want to say, in a sort of, I don't know, I'm not sure the right word, but it would, I think it would also give more confidence to the process. If it's transparent, everyone would know how it's being done. That would also be helpful. I see Hamid's hand is up, so I'll stop there. Maybe I've said something wrong and he's come jumping in to correct me.
Hamid, briefly, please.
No, not at all, not at all. No, I just remembered something when we were talking about services, really. Which is, we seem to forget that we came out of the Uruguay round saying that for both agriculture and services, the achievement really was to put the system in place. And that's why we decided on what we used to call the built-in agenda negotiations. And we said, we will come back to the negotiating table 5 years after the establishment of the WTO, which we did in 2000. And then things got folded into the Doha round. The question is now, we're talking a lot about agriculture, which is terribly important, but we seem to have forgotten about the built-in agenda, which was a leftover from the Uruguay round. And maybe politically speaking, and what needs to be done is just to remind the membership that, you know, agriculture had another negotiation that was meant to go hand in hand with it. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Gabriel Masso has asked for the floor.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I'm on my phone. I had two comments. One, to support the lady who spoke just before Hamid about the role of the Secretariat. You may have heard that after COP28, in the Committee on Trade and Environment, some governments raised issue about the DG taking initiatives on a series of measures. And her answer was, listen, climate is part of the mandate of WTO. My job as DG is to make sure that WTO delivers. So I will continue to take those initiatives. And politely, she said something like, I don't want to hear about that anymore. However, I think the point raised, if I understood correctly, is good. What does it mean, the views of the Secretariat? Because there can be different views on different things. So what is important, once you say, okay, the Secretariat should have views, is to how it is delivered and coordinated and all this, not just saying the Secretariat should speak. The other point that I wanted to raise on another issue mentioned earlier about developing country, Matthew talked about, and others, the fact that sometimes or often when benefits or advantage or flexibilities are given to developing countries, a lot of the donors don't want to give it because you have to give it also to China. It's the issue of subcategories. Some of them exist. I just wanted to recall that in an important appellate body report, some solutions were suggested for that. That is, that if you give a preference, I'm not talking about S&D, a preference, you can draft your program so that it targets a subgroup. What the requirement is that similarly situated countries are treated similarly. This is a door to introduce giving to some who are more in needs, so long as all those sort of, in the same situation are treated similarly. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Simon, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you, Patrick, and it's been great listening to everyone. I'm going to ask 2 questions and make a couple of comments along the way. So let me start by applauding the amazing patience of the private sector with WTO as an organization. And we have, we're almost into our 3rd decade since anything has happened. And most investment projects, are a matter of years, not decades. So for them to stick with us, I think is absolutely remarkable. I almost think that the only people who have any patience left for this are professors and diplomats, if I may be so blunt. Which sort of leads me to the first question: why does this just take so long? Fundamentally, why does this take so long? And here, then, I've got a couple of hypotheses I'd like to run by you. The first is, when it comes to the manufacturing side of the shop in FDI, what I hear when I go to Davos are large companies telling me they can get what they want from governments without trade agreements and without trade diplomats. They can get through their FDI deals. There's a massive chase for FDI. They can get the incentives they want. They can get the tariff cuts they want. They can get the visas they want. So why do they need negotiated binding accords? Why do the big guys need it? And if they don't, then the support has to really come from the small and medium-sized enterprises, which are, it's a very noble constituency, but it's a smaller constituency than the whole business community. On the services side of the shop, it does not surprise me that no progress has been made in decades. In many countries, governments decided to take politics out of regulation by creating independent regulators in many of these service sectors. And those independent regulators like their independence. They are deeply distrustful of trade negotiators. They think the trade negotiators would negotiate their mothers for a better deal, okay? And so they are not in the market for anything which is serious. They're at the most, one will have perhaps the gaps a little bit more maybe. So the second hypothesis is that the way in which regulation is structured on services undercuts the ability of multilateral progress in this area. And then the third sort of root cause is that because this thing has been going on for so long, you have to wonder which bright young people would honestly want to build a career in multilateral trade diplomacy. So the second question is, if you had a child who's just graduating from university, would you recommend that they become a specialist in multilateral trade diplomacy, given what's happened this century? Thank you.
Not sure what the meaning of your last comment was, but anyhow, does anyone, any of the panelists like to comment on anything that's been said? Or we can fish for more questions, more observations. I think some of Simon's points are actually quite interesting. The idea that services already have another approach to regulation and domestically, and that this is an inhibiting factor in going multilateral. I don't know how true that is, but yeah, Hamid.
Yeah, I think Simon's point is very, very relevant. There is, I think, another aspect to it in capitals, which I have witnessed on several occasions. It is true that regulators are very jealous of their own turf, but there is also a weakness on the side of the trade negotiating machinery in capitals in explaining to regulators the proper interface between trade liberalization, basically, which is not that intrusive on the regulatory agenda, and the benefits of trying to actually have some kind of binding assurance that attracts foreign direct investment. The conversation stops because the trade ministries, or those responsible for trade negotiations, do not actually interact with regulators in ways that would sort of disentangle the question of liberalization from regulatory sovereignty. It is definitely an issue that we see in many capitals, not just developing countries. So Back to you.
Anyone else? Okay, well, I think, you know, Matthew has made a lot of the development dimension of the multilateral trading system and his concern, which I believe is shared by many other delegations. And I just wanted to ask Matthew for a reaction to the idea that we deal with differential treatment, or let's call it SDT for the sake of argument, in a slightly different way by separating out all the market access aspects of this from the rules and regulations aspect. The rules and regulations aspect is basically a proposition of eventual convergence. And the question then is at what pace and how. And I think if we dealt with that as the core of SDT, we might get somewhere, because the market access part of it, which is always underlies a lot, I think a lot of the resistance of developing countries to give anything up is because they're going to get hit over the head for greater liberalization. And that's one of the reasons you see many developing countries with much less than with status quo tariffs way below the bound rates, because they don't want to get into the game of binding those. But everyone, there's a sense in which if developing countries are getting SDT on market access, so are the rich countries. It's not really an SDT issue. If we took market access out of it, everyone has their sacred tariffs that they don't want to lower. If we just put that aside, and it's not a coincidence that many developing countries have applied rates that are far below what they've committed in the WTO. I think the WTO is not a very good place to negotiate trade liberalization. What if we did that, Matthew? Could we then really make some progress in incorporating development and development issues via an approach that focuses on regulation and the avoidance of hidden protectionism and fundamental inefficiency?
I don't know, Patrick, maybe you could do a study on it for us. But frankly, I think what you're talking about is looking at an irrational system rationally. So I'm not exactly sure how that would work. And what do I mean when I say it's an irrational system? Because S&D, no matter if we like it or not, is enshrined in the Marrakesh Agreement and the WTO rules and regulations. No one is going to give up an enshrined right. It's just not going to happen politically, all right? You have a lot of geopolitical issues outside which are infusing what certain countries want to do inside the WTO, which have nothing to do with the rules, nothing to do with market access, nothing to do with regulations. It has to do with what their geopolitical stance is outside of the WTO. So I'm not sure how even trying to find kind of variable geometry around SDT, I don't know exactly how that is going to work out, because you're going to have some stalwarts who are simply going to say there is absolutely no mandate, no interest, nothing that says that we need to look at a new way to give SNDT. So I think you might have to kind of get over some of the political hurdles, which I think will be very, very difficult to do. I mean, that said, as I mentioned, I mean, there have been, some efforts and some success in looking at different ways of providing different treatment to different countries. The trade facilitation agreement is a great example of that, and I think that has been somewhat influenced the investment facilitation for development agreement as well. But I don't think anybody has ever, unless I have missed it, has ever really done a truly impactful study to show how can we layer this new approach of looking at differential treatment into the future work of the WTO. So people have just recognized what the TFA was able to do and put it in a box. And I think maybe we need to do, or you, the academics as well, with the policymakers, need to do a bit more thinking on that. So there's no easy answer to it, but I just know that it's so infused with so much politics that it would be difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure it would. But difficult doesn't mean insurmountable. Professor Liu wishes to take the floor.
Hi, thanks, Patrick. Sorry for being late. I was stuck in something because I'm right now in China. I just want to follow up on this discussion, very interestingly, on the market access issue. I think you made a very good point in saying that this kind of eventual convergence and trying to make sure that developing countries in long term even would converge into kind of the same level. I mean, hopefully one day, same level of market access commitments as developed countries and others. But there's another point I think which we should also look at because I think if we put ourselves into the shoes of the developing countries, especially LDCs, I think in their eyes, the market access issue and trade liberalization probably means something specific to them. I think if we recall to before Doha and during Doha, you remember LDCs, they want duty-free and quota-free, which is still on the agenda. I think in the Doha mandate, or even before that, there's also the specific point on, if I remember correctly, the liberalization on products of export interests to developing countries, and which would touch upon the tariff peak and also tariff escalation issues, so on and so forth, existing in both developed countries and also advanced developed countries. So I think on that point, probably market access is still of priority to developed countries, including LDCs, which we should also look at and together with the eventual convergence of developing countries also committed towards long-term liberalization. So I just want to add a point on that. Thanks.
If developing countries were to standardize their market access commitments to those of rich countries, they'd be putting agricultural products up to 40%. Anyhow, is there anyone else who'd like to take the floor? Not you again. I mean you, please, Hamid, go ahead.
I expect nothing less from you, Patrick. Just going back to the point that João mentioned regarding the role of the Secretariat in raising the level of awareness, information, and knowledge of delegations. And that sort of reminded me of what used to happen in the past. But it also reminded me of something else that you will find in the paper here, which is the interconnectedness between the three functions. We were talking about raising knowledge in order to build capacity to negotiate. But this also, a lot of that happens within the deliberative function itself. And the deliberative function has been hampered by obstructionist stances by some delegations. This member-driven mantra has led to simply removing the Secretariat from the level of activity that used to take place. Now, that's why I think the point I'm making here is it's very important to look at the interconnectedness between the three functions, because it's very difficult to reform one without the other. If there is an active deliberative function within the Services Council, for example, this would inform delegations, particularly new delegates who have come to town, about the rules within the agreement, the progressive liberalization mechanisms that call for certain activities, and will provoke the kind of requests that the Secretariat used to have in the past. We used to do background notes on all services sectors with sectoral discussions. The level of information that was generated on those occasions, I think, unfortunately, has not been happening for the past almost 13, 14 years now. So that's all. Thanks. Back to you, Patrick.
Any other questions, observations from panelists or anybody else? Then I'm going to ask one final question to the panelists. Provocative question. Do you consider, you can refuse to answer, of course, do you consider that some members are sometimes tempted sometimes succumb to the temptation to use the consensus principle as an instrument of veto, which may or may not have something to do with the issue at hand. Okay, I'll start with Matthew.
Okay, sorry, Patrick. I was chatting with Colette online just now, and she was giving me some information on a document she had done for S&P. Yeah, so can you repeat the question for me? My apologies.
The question is the following. Okay, now I've got you on the run. Good. The question is the following. What if I was to argue that there are some members who take advantage of the consensus rule to exercise a veto, which doesn't always have something to do with the issues at hand? Would you say that is a false observation or a true one? Because if it's a true one, then that's something we should work on.
I mean, you said I didn't have to answer, so, but no, I think it's true. I think it's true. Let's be clear, it's true. And that's all I can say about it. It's true.
Yeah, no, well, I guess that's already something, eh? Valerie or João? Hamid?
Well, yeah, that's what's happening. And
because if it is true, it is a major obstacle to real progress. And one of the ways of the JSIs are trying to get around it is to use the schedules.
Yeah.
And I think that is actually quite an effective way, but it's not necessarily the most efficient way to do business as a community, if you see what I mean.
Lack of consensus on the basics of the basics.
Yeah. Valerie, any comment on veto?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. I think this sort of, I mean, listen, I can't read into the hearts of the motivations, but this goes to what we say at the beginning of the paper, where at some point there needs to be a reaffirmation of principles. Do you subscribe? Are you going to be a good player or not? And do you subscribe and to the basics, fundamentals? Because if you're starting to co-opt certain, I don't know, rule for other purposes, we're not all working towards the same goal. So I think there's a bigger question behind this, is what I would say. And then I was just going to also add is just to Professor Abernet's point on, young people, given the number of resumes we're receiving, I think they haven't gotten the memo yet. Maybe they're all on TikTok. I don't know. So.
Okay, Hamid, you want to say something about veto and consensus?
I think unfortunately this is true, that consensus is being used for veto, but I would caution that this should not be understood to mean that the rule of consensus needs to be changed. I think what needs to happen perhaps is a bit of clarification of existing rules, because part of the problem is that consensus is being required where it is not actually needed. To say that you need consensus in order to launch a plurilateral negotiation is something that is not in the rules. And these are the kind of conversations that need to take place to clarify that, sorry, if you're saying you need consensus here, where do you see this in the rules? It just does not exist. And this is part of the problem of JSI's negotiations as they have been progressing now. But yes, there needs to be something done, but clarifying existing rules, I think, is an important part of it. Thanks.
Okay, we've on the clock. We have 5 minutes. We can either stop, or can I just invite the panelists if they'd like to say a final few words or not, as they wish. João, have you got any words of wisdom for us to depart with?
Well, I would not depart. I think it's not the best times, but the system has value. It will be difficult. We need to persevere. We need to try to take steps forward. until the situation changes, whenever it is, I don't know. I think it will take a bit of time. The challenge here is to get business interested, because it's difficult with the progress and the state of the organization to get business interested. So it's important that business continues to see an interest beyond the immediate. Although that in business you want, of course, a much more faster results. But I think that's the world we are now. The world of the 90s and early 2000s is gone, and that's the world we are now. It does not mean that the system is perfect, needs some rewiring, but it will take time, because the ones that used to push and to be leaders don't want to be leaders. And in the meantime, there is a number of other mid-sized important countries that come and pushing in different directions. This complicates completely the panorama. But let's not despair. I continue to be a firm believer on the interest of the system.
Thanks very much. Matthew, anything?
Yes, please do not give up on the system. You know, see the WTO as a bit of a dam. If it were not there, you would be incredibly amazed at the amount of water that will be hitting you directly in your face. So although it does not always seem to be moving the way you want it to do, just its stability is enough. So, well, maybe not enough, but its stability, I think, needs to be recognized and respected. And 20 years ago, if you had told me that we would be discussing MSME issues and women and trade issues in WTO, and even the kind of deep climate change issues that are happening in the informal discussions, I would tell you no way. So one should not discount that the WTO has actually progressed in some important files in the past 20 years. So don't give up on it. Thanks.
Thanks.
And tell your kids, come join. We need good people. We need good people.
This would be a good career, Simon. Okay, Valerie.
I would just say is that we, from the private sector perspective, we're as we said, we're hanging in there. We really do want to see progress. So please count on us for support. We want to help and work on it together. So, you know, anything that we can do to help, please let us know.
Okay, now you have 30 seconds, Hamid. You should put you should unmute if you want us to hear your unmute. You've already eaten 15. Go ahead.
All right. I think this conversation about reform, I would sort of put a health warning on it. It is by nature negatively biased. In other words, when you talk about reform, you're pointing at what is not working in the system. But this should not actually create the misperception that the system really is falling apart. I think I would stress what Matthew said about how important the system is. Because if I compare the situation we have now, even if you call it dysfunctional situation, if I compare this with 35 years back with the GATT, I will see that we have a legal and treaty infrastructure now that we have in place, which is extremely difficult to rebuild if it falls apart. So I would not want the kind of sort of negative color of the conversation about reform to lead us to actually not see how valuable what we have is and how much we need to fight for it and preserve it. So there you go.
Thank you very much. It's now 3:31, so you overshot, Hamid, but that's okay, we'll forgive you. So I'd just like to end by thanking the panelists very much for their contributions, and to those who joined in, and I hope the rest of you enjoyed the session. Okay, well, with that, thank you very much indeed. And let's, Lou, do you want to say anything?
Yes, thanks, Patrick. Just two quick words. The first thing is that the day after tomorrow is going to be the first day of the new year of the Lunar New Year, and so let me take this opportunity on behalf of the board of FMG and the whole FMG group to wish you all a happy Lunar New Year. And this is also the year of the dragon, so which is very auspicious. And according to Asian culture, it is a year to get things done, to make the rain. So I also wish the ambassadors and ministers, DG directors, the whole secretariat, successful MC13. And please do, you heard from Valerie and also the whole panel about what we expect from you. So please do your job for successful MC13, and we have high expectations for you. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.